Well, Yvonne, yeah, the atmosphere here is just phenomenal. There is so much energy. People are singing and dancing in the streets, waving flags, hanging off the back of cars. And it really feels like a big celebration of democracy. And that's because the right to vote in Timor-Leste was so hard won. This weekend, the country is celebrating 21 years of independence, marking the end of centuries of occupation by the Portuguese, which was then followed by an invasion by Indonesia in 1975. And it wasn't until 2002 that Timor-Leste finally gained its independence. And so the right and the ability to vote here in Timor-Leste is really not taken for granted, and you can see that reflected in the scenes that we're seeing in the streets, the exuberance of voters.
So bring us up to date. Who are the front runners in this election and how have they been doing during the campaign?
Well, there are 17 political parties running in this campaign. The two main ones to watch are CNRT and Fretilin. Now, these political parties have a long history in Timor-Leste. They were both closely involved in the independence movement, and their leaders are both sort of considered resistance-era heroes here in the country. So for CNRT, you've got Xanana Gusmao. He was the country's first president and was a former guerrilla commander during the Indonesian occupation. And for Fretilin, you've got Marian Faa, who was the country's first Prime Minister. Now, he was exiled for many years during the Indonesian occupation, but was played a very big role in negotiating independence. So these two men, they were united in their struggle for independence, but these days they're fierce political rivals, and it's actually believed that this may be the final election that they run in. Both men are in their 70s, and so that's just making them all the more determined to win.
And what do you think will sway voters either way? What issues are most important in this election?
Well, this election is coming down to resistance-era credentials, like I mentioned, those independence heroes really drawing on that legacy. But another key issue for Timor-Leste is the state of the economy. So oil and gas revenues that the country relies heavily on are predicted to dry up within a decade according to current trends. And so the next government will really have the challenge of securing new sources of income for Timor-Leste. Now, for Xanana Gusmao, the solution lies in the Greater Sunrise oil and gas fields between Timor-Leste and Australia. Now, that project has been stalled for many years over negotiations of where to process the oil and gas. Xanana Gusmao is adamant that the product should be processed domestically in Timor-Leste to create jobs here. For Marian Faa, he seems much more focused on diversification and developing new industries such as tourism and agriculture, although he does say he will support the Greater Sunrise project if it's deemed economically and practically feasible. So that is a major issue. But for voters on the ground, things like jobs and the state of the health and education systems will also weigh into how people vote on Sunday.
And what's at stake here? How significant is this election, and what should we in Australia be looking out for in particular?
Well, as I mentioned, it's a big election just because it could be the last for these resistance-era heroes, as I mentioned, and that's a big deal for Timor-Leste. These are revered figures that everyone in the country knows and respects. But there is some sense among people that they're the political elite don't necessarily reflect the young voters, which make up about 75% of people that are going to be going to the polls this weekend, which is a huge amount. And so there is among some people's desire for some fresh faces in politics to really reflect that demographic.
And Marianne, when are we likely to see results?
Well, voters are heading to the polls on Sunday, and we should see results start to come through later that night and into Monday morning. But it's unlikely that either of the major political parties will win an outright majority. So in that case, they will have to enter into a coalition in order to form government, and those negotiations could take days or even weeks before we have a final outcome.
Meanwhile, a few high-profile Australians have received awards today, Timor-Leste's highest honour for their service to the nation. What can you tell us about these?
Yeah, so 6 Australians received an Order of Timor-Leste today, and as you mentioned, that's the highest honour that can be awarded. One of those recipients was the Australian barrister Bernard Collaery, who was charged for exposing the Australian government after it allegedly bugged Timor-Leste parliamentary officers to gain an upper hand in oil and gas negotiations in 2004. Now, the charges against Mr Collaery have been dropped under the new Australian government, but he has a long history, a relationship with Timor-Leste that goes beyond that. He was an advisor to the government in the very, very early days of its independence. And here's what he had to say before he received that award today.
I've supported them for many, many years in their struggle. In later years it became controversial due to matters concerning Australian misconduct. This medal is not in any way related purely to the fact that the coalition government tried to jail me for continuing my support for Timor.
Marian, thanks for updating us on the Timor-Leste election.
Thanks, Yvonne. Glad to join you.